Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to another in the series of Enterprising Women in Commerce. Today's a little different, as you can probably already tell. I love coming back to this series. Some of you may recall that I spoke earlier in this series, and we've heard from any number of really accomplished women. And today, we're going to hear from two very accomplished men. Bruce Andrews, who's our Deputy Secretary of Commerce, and Jay Williams, who's our Assistant Secretary for Economic Development. Now, I'm not going to do their bios because part of the first thing we're going to ask them to do is for them to describe a bit of their career paths. So they will give you their bios in their own words. But we do thank you, gentlemen, for joining the Enterprising Women of Commerce series. And I did want to take a moment to set the stage because I think it's very relevant to invite some gentlemen into this discussion. I believe personally that most of the things that one needs to do to have success in one's career and achieve great things is not unique to gender. Having said that, so I think one of the things I'm looking forward to in talking to Bruce and Jay is learning from them some of the things that they think have contributed to their career success thus far and what they've accomplished. And that is not to underestimate, though, the challenges that women in particular or people of color or groups that aren't as well represented in senior leadership positions as we would like. That is not to underestimate. There are challenges, perhaps, that are faced. So we would also like to hear from these two gentlemen about their perspectives on working with women in the workplace and how they think about this from their perspective. So with that, I'm going to get the conversation going. If you would, we're going to go ahead and have a dialogue up here with a little bit of Q&A with the guys up here, and then we'll hold time at the end for questions from the audience. So if that works for everybody, let's just jump in. So for each of you, I'm going to ask you to give a brief summary of your own career path, what you think contributed to achieving the august positions you currently hold. Talk about, in particular, perhaps any challenges or roadblocks you may have faced and how you overcame them and kind of what the lessons learned were. And maybe I'll start this question with Bruce. If you could go ahead.
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you for having me here today. And I'm sure there was a little bit, when the email went out, I have no doubt there was a little bit of a reaction of, okay, what do these two guys know, and what wisdom or help can they bring to talking to a group of women? And part of it is, I think, starting from a perspective, and I'll give my career, but I think one of the things that's so interesting to me is having people around you with various perspectives. And I actually, ironically, think I am somewhat well qualified to be on this panel for the following reason, which is, as a father of two young daughters, who I look at what is the world that I want them to grow up in, and how do I want to make sure they're successful in what I can do now at ages 9 and 11, but also being the husband of a very successful in her own right wife who we have sort of spent our lives trading off who is the flexible spouse, and maybe we'll talk about that a little bit later, but is the sibling of my sister was the first woman dean of a top 10 med school. She's the vice chancellor and the dean of Duke University. But then as a son of a working mother and going through that, but also as an employer, where 4 of the 6 people in my office, in my immediate office, are actually women. And it turns out perhaps ultimately being an employee of a woman secretary first as her chief of staff, and then as the deputy, and as her deputy. But with regards to career, I've actually been pretty lucky over the course of time to have a whole bunch of interesting opportunities. I came to Washington just under 25 years ago. It will be 25 years in September, thinking I would be in Washington for 2 or 3 years, and then I would pack my bags back up and go back to upstate New York, where I'm from originally. And I've been lucky to have a series of opportunities, both in the public sector and in the private sector, working on Capitol Hill when I was young, going to law school at night at Georgetown, working at a law firm until I sort of recognized that perhaps the law firm business model was not really for me, working at a government affairs, public affairs firm here in town, being a vice president at Ford Motor Company during what was probably the hardest time in the last 50 years of the company's history, during both the fuel economy debate, but also during the bailout of GM and Chrysler. And then returning to public service, something that I'd always when I'd originally come to Washington for, to be the General Counsel of the Senate Commerce Committee, and then coming to the department first as the Secretary's Chief of Staff for Secretary Bryson, and then Acting Secretary Blank, and then Secretary Pritzker, and then becoming the Deputy Secretary about a year ago, a little over a year ago. Throughout that, though, the common theme has, I think, really been two things. One is a love of the intersection of policy, politics, and the business world, and how those all fit together. And then the other is just sort of, and I got to admit, I've never really had a plan, but I also always knew kind of the direction I wanted to go. And that direction led me to opportunities where my golden rule was always leave more doors open when you leave this opportunity than what you came in with. Because frankly, I never would have predicted I would end up where I am today. And if you ask me what I'm going to be doing in 5 or 10 years, I don't know. But what I can tell you is knowing approximately the right direction and trying to live to a couple sets of rules that have really helped me to find good opportunities and frankly, be very fortunate to have those opportunities over the course of time. What did I not answer in your multi-part question? Roadblocks are interesting because I have to admit, for those of you who know me, I have a relatively sunny disposition in life. And so I've got to admit the roadblocks, there actually have been a number, but I frankly don't really pay that much attention because I just keep going and treat everything as an opportunity and okay, what's the next step going forward? But there always are roadblocks. And I think, probably, what is the biggest roadblock I've faced? Actually, I have to think about that. Probably the biggest roadblock is not getting to jobs and not feeling like, okay, I necessarily know what the next step is or being able to achieve the next step when I got to the point in that position that I really felt like, okay, I'm ready to do the next thing. That's probably the biggest set of roadblocks, sort of stepping back and then saying, okay, how do I find my way in the direction that I want to go in the long term?
Thanks, Ellen, and thank you all for inviting us to join you. As Bruce had indicated, when the invitation went out and I saw my name and Bruce's name on it, there was a bit of concern because there was such a high bar to clear here with Dr. Sullivan and Michelle Wee. And in fact, it took two of us to even begin to qualify to be here. I think it speaks volumes for the women here at Commerce. But in terms of career progression, my career started actually in a position that was typically not a position that men served in back in 1990. I started as a bank teller. And back in 1990, while there were a handful of bank tellers that were men, I was one of the very few at one of the local banks to start in that position. It was just a part-time job in college, but it did start my professional career because ultimately from there, I matriculated into the management training program and ultimately ended up managing a bank branch. I spent some time with the Federal Reserve System as a commercial bank examiner, went back to private banking as a vice president running a lending operation, and ultimately meandered my way into public service. And I say meandered my way because like Bruce, it was ironic that I really never had a career plan, a specific career plan. Always knew that I wanted to do something that I enjoyed, always knew that I wanted to do something that involved service, not necessarily public service, but providing a service. So I enjoyed banking because at that point I was in banking and we were doing providing banking services to the underrepresented communities. We were doing banking in areas and neighborhoods that I grew up in to individuals who, to this day, there are people who still come up to me and talk to me about how we were able to encourage them to get their first mortgage loan, and this was 20-some years ago. So providing banking and services in that regard was something that I thought I'd spend my career doing. That changed when banking became more about sales and pushing products on people, and I just didn't think that that was something that I wanted to do. So I got into public service. I left the bank and went to work for the city of Youngstown, and I remember, interestingly enough, that the president of the bank pulled me aside and said, why on earth would you want to go in public service? Those are just dead-end jobs. There are a lot of perks and benefits to being in banking, but to go work for a public entity, he just couldn't wrap his mind around that. And I thought this was a great opportunity to start making a change again. And at that point, I was focused on community development and a little bit of economic development. So I got into that for a few years. Did that, got into planning, and I'm not a planner by trade, but it sort of led me into planning initiatives. And one thing led to another, and I ultimately ended up running for public office. So I served, ran and was elected as a mayor of Youngstown, Ohio. Was the first African-American mayor and the youngest mayor in the city's history. All that time, I knew I still wanted to do something that involved community development, economic development, reaching out and providing services to, again, places where I grew up, underserved, underrepresented communities. I, from a very early age, had an interest in Washington, D.C., and thought that I would ultimately end up working here one day, but again, like Bruce, not having a plan of how I would get there. Having done that, I ultimately had an opportunity to serve in the administration, which brought me here to Washington, D.C. I stepped down as mayor a couple of years early, which wasn't what I had planned to do, but the opportunity to do that type of work with this administration on a national scale was certainly something very compelling to me. So it's really been about, to the extent of wanting to be prepared for that next opportunity, if not necessarily knowing what that next opportunity was. Also very similar to Bruce, there have been a number of roadblocks, but I didn't necessarily see them as roadblocks. My default position is also very optimistic and outgoing, which has its benefits, but also has its drawbacks. So to me, the roadblocks meant, find another way to accomplish what it is that you are seeking to accomplish. It isn't always easy. The answers don't always come. Sometimes the lessons are very hard learned and over a very long period of time. But I view those roadblocks, again, as just either opportunities to go another way or to figure out a different way around, which ultimately has led to being here and to the point that was raised. I started the administration at the Department of Labor, had an opportunity to work in the White House for a year, but the ultimate culmination, as far as I have seen it, has really been to be here at the Department of Commerce and to be here at this time under the leadership of Secretary Pritzker and so many other folks that I've had a chance to work with at the Economic Development Administration has really been wonderful. So as you are surrounded with accomplished women in your office, I am also, a couple of whom are here with me today, making sure that I don't screw it up. But really, it's been an interesting and diverse career path with lots of lessons learned.
Thank you. I find it interesting that you both talked about an optimism or always looking at a roadblock as an opportunity to be overcome. I think some of the studies that have been done on the most senior leaders, whether they be in government, in business, or in other areas, do often talk about a trait of, if not optimism, at least that a determination to overcome and not be stopped by the obstacles. So there's maybe our first tidbit to take away from that. I wanted to now switch gears. You have had these amazing careers that have led you to a place where you're at very senior levels in a large organization. So from that perspective, and because we're going to get to more personal perspectives later, but as the perspective of a senior leader in a relatively large organization, I've got two questions. One is, how do you think about empowering employees in general? And then dropping down a level, how do you think about helping people who are just starting their careers to advance, whether it be your own approach, things you do, or kind of advice you give people? So maybe this time we'll start with Jay and then go to Bruce.
I think it's exceptionally important to empower employees, and part of the way I and our leadership team attempt to do that is making sure that they have the resources that are necessary, the resources that they need to do their job. Nothing is more frustrating to have a job or assignment and not have the resources to get that job done. Now, there are always a scarcity of resources, but it's important to make sure they have the resources. It's also important to make sure that they have the autonomy to do their job. One of the things that I like to do is to make it very clear that I am there as a resource, I am there as a support, but I don't want to micromanage you. I have always said to my staff that if I'm the smartest person in the room, there's a problem. I want people on my team who are more proficient, who are smarter, who are more adroit at what they do than I am individually. Collectively, as a leader, my job is to bring them together and try to bring the best out of all the people who are on the team but to the extent that I need them to be more proficient at their particular job is something that I think is empowering, and then relying on them to do that. And to the extent of holding people accountable, I don't mean that in a negative sense. My default position is that if you're here contributing to this team, I have the confidence that you're going to do the things necessary to help bring this team and accomplish its mission. And until I'm proven otherwise, that's going to be my position, and that's the trust that I'm going to have. So in terms of the second part of the question and people starting off their career, to the extent that I try to make myself an open book and share my stories and remember how it was when I was starting the career. One of the things that I didn't do enough early on sometimes was ask enough questions, because you want to come in and appear prepared and appear very competent. But one thing that struck me since I've been at the Department of Commerce that I will never forget is being in several meetings with Secretary Pritzker and having a lot of discussions going on and seeing her stop the meeting and saying, wait a minute, I don't understand that. Explain that concept to me. So it was so powerful, because here's Secretary of Commerce Penny Pritzker, who is accomplished in her own right, stopping a meeting and asking some very basic fundamental questions. And I know a lot of us were sitting around the table nodding our head and taking notes and probably had very little idea of some of the things that we're discussing, but none of us had the courage or the wherewithal to say, stop, I don't understand. So to see her do that is something that has encouraged me, and something that I try to convey is don't be afraid to ask the questions. We don't assume that you know it all. Make sure that you do have that confidence. Make sure that you're willing to put in the work necessary and be prepared. But at the end of the day, there are still going to be things you don't know. So I really try to a certain extent disarm people who are starting their career, make it known that we've all made mistakes. And I tell the staff that in the field that we're in, it's an important field, but making a wrong decision at ADA, no one's going to die. There's not a patient on the table that if we screw up so badly, somebody's going to lose their life. We can make the mistake, learn from it, try not to make it again, and move on for it. So things like that, when people are starting their career, that those things are going to happen. But unless you're an intern at GW or at one of the hospitals, there are very few mistakes we're going to make. They're going to end up in life or death situations.
So I guess 2 seconds. Okay, good. So I'd say a couple things and agree with Jay on everything he said. One of my rules has always been to hire people smarter than me. Because frankly, you want to bring in the best talent, and you want people who, especially when you're the boss, you want people who they'll help make you look good, and you'll help make them look good. So empowering your team and giving them the opportunity for them to be the ones showing all the good work and the things they've done. I think if you build a team, and team is really the key word. Another thing that I look very much for is collaboration and people who can work together. I generally don't think it's the best individual who proves to be most successful in an organization. Usually it's the person who can be the best part of a team and collaborate together. And one of the things when I was the chief of staff or the secretary is we built the team. We very carefully looked at and picked people, not just because of their talents, not just because of their experience, not how smart they were, but that they would fit into the team environment. And it's something that I always try to accentuate, because we're only going to be successful if we do it working together. I also am big on trusting my people. And the reason you hire smart people and talented people is you trust them to go do the job. You don't micromanage, and frankly, sometimes I probably don't micromanage to a fault, but trusting people and letting them go do their jobs, but also with sort of what I call trust but verify, to the extent of make sure that they're on the right path, and then frankly, look for them, and Jay said something that's very important, which is don't be afraid to ask the question, particularly if you don't understand the assignment or you don't know the direction, because I think too often people will go off and try to figure it out, whereas if you come back and ask a 30-second question, it can save you a whole host of work. That's what I generally look for in trying to build a team together of people who will work really well together. Another thing, and I think this is a critical part of being a manager and having a good team, is just being available to your team so that they can ask those questions. I think too often managers are not necessarily accessible, and so it's so important that as you have that team, that good team around you, but you're also providing constant guidance and feedback to people to help them in terms of how they do their job. So what would I say to people starting careers? One thing Jay said that I think is that was a question, right? Which is do something you enjoy. Enjoy what you do, and really seek out things that you're going to find fulfilling. Because frankly, I think too often people get into jobs where they don't enjoy what they're doing, or they're not seeking fulfillment out of it. And particularly for young people, finding opportunities and experiences to develop themselves, and particularly not to be afraid to take risks and frankly learn that even when it doesn't go well. And I think one of the things when you asked about roadblocks earlier, one of the reasons that I don't look back and see a lot of things as roadblocks, when even things didn't go well or go the way I wanted to them, it was really, okay, what did I learn from them and how do we move forward? And I actually spend a lot of time thinking about this for my girls, about how to teach them to be willing to be risk takers and not to be too cautious and take opportunities and just, take calculated risks, be smart about it, but seek out opportunities, because my experience, generally the rewards are a lot higher when you stretch yourself and take a risk trying to do something rather than just doing what's safe and easy, rather than putting yourself out there and trying to do something a little more challenging.
Thank you. We're going to move on now to a more personal question. And I will, in full disclosure, I was asked this question when I spoke, and my answer was, I have no work-life balance, so don't ask me. So this question is about work-life balance. What are just your general observations, experiences, thoughts on how to achieve work-life balance, what the difficulty is in doing so, and how you cope with managing work-life balance? Bruce, do you want to go first?
So if I had to evaluate one thing I probably fail on more than other things, this is probably the toughest question. And I do think this is a really difficult topic, in a world that is very fast-paced, in a city that is high intensity, in positions that are very challenging, and it's hard. It's plain that simple. I got asked this question in a previous iteration as well, and acknowledge that I don't necessarily do a good job of it. I think my 9-year-old would probably be the best, and I think she would probably not give me a positive rating on this one. With that said, I do think it's recognizing what's important and setting your priorities and frankly structuring your world, because the one thing I do think that's changed in the last 20 years since I started working in Washington, 25 years, is the ability to have better structure around your work life so that you try to find what the best semblance of balance you can. And so for me, it's a couple things. One is it's trying to get out of the office as early as I can, which sometimes is not in my control, but getting out, getting home and spending time with my family, particularly till my kids go to bed. And the number of times I say to people, okay, I really want to talk to you, but I'm going to call you after 9:15 when my kids get to bed, which it turns out is often some of my most productive time of the day, is structured to really build around the work-life balance. The other thing is, and this is more, I think, for people who are married and have kids, but is, the old, leave it to beaver model of the world, frankly, just doesn't work anymore. I shouldn't say it doesn't work anymore. It does work for some people, but in a city where often people have two careers, my wife's been very fortunate to be the staff director of a subcommittee in the Senate and then the chief of staff at a big independent agency, and now has a career as a financial services consultant. Figuring out who's going to be the flexible spouse and who is going to be involved with sort of taking care of the kids. The funny thing is there are a whole bunch of moms in my kids' school who don't know my wife's email because I'm always the one who plans the play dates. So it's sort of and in full disclosure, I actually spent 3 years as a class parent in my kids' school. I did it 1 year, and then my other daughter said, no, I really want you to do it for my class too. And carving out the time and frankly working with whoever my boss was at the time and hoping that they understand of, hey, look, I'll get the job done, I'll get the work done, but I need to do it in my way, not necessarily, 9 to 5 or 6 or 7 or 9 or whatever it is. So it is something that's really hard, but I've been lucky that my wife and I have a real partnership in terms of how we make it all work, and sometimes it's not all pretty, where the balls, you just got to keep the balls from dropping. But it just takes a lot of focus and planning your world out in a way that you meet the needs of whatever your personal life needs are, while also meeting your work life needs. And what I find is, one of the things that I look for in hiring talent is you look for the person. And who do you want on your team? And once you want that person, then you figure out how to make the relationship with them work. And I think, sometimes in new jobs, it's a front-end investment. But once you do that, my view on being a boss always is, hey, I get talented people, I invest in them, and then I want to figure out how to make the balance work to keep them around and allow them to be successful and to thrive. I actually find that workers, that employees are much happier. And frankly, I know this for myself as well. I'm much happier if I can find some semblance of that balance rather than it being out of balance, because frankly, I'm not going to do as well in my personal life or in my professional life if I'm not able to strike that balance.
Not surprisingly, a very similar answer that Bruce gave. I think I am fairly good at trying to help establish and promote that work-life balance for my employees and my staff, and I think I'm pretty terrible, and my wife would validate that, at applying it to myself. It's just difficult. And you think, well, this is what you want to do to create a great environment for your employees. Make sure they understand that from the top, the boss, quote unquote, understands and values work-life balance. And when you need flexibility in your schedule, and when you need to just, take care of the things that are also important to your life. But somehow I keep forgetting that is something that I also need to demonstrate and apply to myself. And there's this feeling of guilt or just not thinking that you've always somehow got to be there. But of course, then that causes challenges at home because typically, to Bruce's point earlier, I always have been fortunate to there are always aspects of our jobs, even jobs that we love, that are going to be miserable aspects of the job. But to the point he raised earlier, I love the work that I do. And I could spend an inordinate amount of time doing that work. But having a wife and a 4-year-old son, that is not the practical or pragmatic approach, and it doesn't lead to very good balance at home. So to the extent of trying to find that balance, Bruce is right, providing that structure and providing that ability to be the flexible parent. And it's something that I have to constantly remind myself of. And not only that, so obviously my wife reminds me, but what I appreciate about my staff is they remind me, because they'll be scheduling an event or a trip, and they will come in and ask me, is this something you really want to do, because it's going to involve you being gone on a weekend or gone, late at night, or having an extended period of time. And my default position, but yeah, it's something that sounds great, sounds interesting, and I think, I'll figure it out at home later. But because my staff has been very helpful in trying to give me that second opportunity not to get in hot water at home, it's helped. And sometimes you need your staff. That's why you have great people around you. So to the extent of trying to actually practice it, and it has also obviously changed having a 4-year-old son and wanting to be at home, and especially in a city like Washington. So one of the big transitions for me, it was in Youngstown, Ohio. Although I was the mayor and it was very demanding, I was still always 15 minutes from home. I could leave City Hall at 8 o'clock and be at home at 8:15, or no matter where I was always within just an arm's reach of being home. Here, it's different because there's an hour commute. So staying here till 7 o'clock means I'm not getting home till 8 or 8:30. And I can't just pop in to an event and pop out and be home, or have my wife and my son there. That was the other thing. As mayor, he was only one, but I could still have them there with me. It's just a different thing here. So I'm having to make that transition of that shift of saying you're going to have to think and act differently to make sure you maintain that work-life balance, because I do enjoy being at home for dinner and reading him a book and being able to put him to bed. So it's a challenge, and I think that as I've tried to create that environment with the leadership team where I have struggled, and I've gotten a little bit better, but continue to struggle, is applying it directly to myself.
Thank you both on that. So this next question is more about strategies for career success, with a caveat that, as we mentioned earlier, we know that women may have more specific coping mechanisms to deal with perhaps some of the more challenging elements of being a woman aspiring to leadership in what are traditionally more male-dominated leadership roles. So putting that, allowing for that, what are some of the strategies as you look back that you think were helpful in achieving your success to date? And again, I'm not sure who wants to go first on that one, but Jay, if you do want to go first on that.
One of the things that I appreciate, understanding, and I certainly am not one to speak on, coping mechanisms or not fully understanding what women would have to go through to achieve, in areas that have typically been dominated by their counterparts. But in terms of some of the career strategies, as I've always found helpful and beneficial, of finding mentors, even if not formal mentors, and certainly there is significant benefit in having formal mentors, but finding people who I admired or I thought were very proficient in a certain aspect, and trying to understand and get inside of their thought process and have conversations with them, again, even if not from a formal mentorship standpoint. The other thing that Bruce talked about is a willingness to take risk. Take smart and calculated risk. I think there's nothing more valuable in learning and progressing in your career, being willing to take risks. I've very much been disinclined to just want to do the safe thing and the thing that's very predictable and comfortable, and there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, people have made wonderful careers and have had wonderful lives doing that, but in terms of early career progression, being willing to take those risks, being willing to make the mistakes and learn from those mistakes and own up to those mistakes are things that I've found valuable. And the other thing of which I think is similar is getting outside of your comfort zone and stretching a little bit. I think those things early on in your career, because at the end of the day, you're going to settle into something, and whether that's settle into it for 30 years or 5 years. And I know the other thing is we talk about a generational difference, that the younger generation now doesn't necessarily intend to go work for a company and be there for 30 years and put in 30 years and retire. It is not uncommon, in fact, to work there 2 or 3 years. You have a skill set that is very much in demand and move on. So I think the final thing is what Bruce talked about, is making sure that you leave the place better off when you leave than it was when you came. Make sure you're contributing something, and that keeps those doors open, because you never know. This is a small, small world. I am continually amazed at the people that I come across in Washington, D.C., that I have met or engaged or encountered somehow, during my days in Youngstown, Ohio. So those relationships are valuable, and it's not just about how you treat people. That's always important, but you just never know, how and when you're going to cross paths again, how that might be of benefit to your career progression, what you might learn from them or be able to do for them. So I think those things are things that I've continued to found of benefit.
All right, so clearly Jay's been reading off the talking points I wrote to myself, because I agree with everything he said. First is just the point on risk, and I kind of call it don't be afraid to get in the game, which is one of the things I've noticed, and it differentiates some of the people who I know. Washington is filled with incredibly talented people, as is this department. We've got really good, talented people, and what often differentiates people is not how smart someone is, how able they are, any of that stuff. It's your willingness to get in the game and play. Don't sit on the sidelines and wait for opportunity to come to you. Go forward and jump in and look for it yourself. Go make those opportunities happen. Ask for the extra assignment, or when a project comes up that they're looking for people to volunteer for them, be the first person there to look, because frankly, that's how you create opportunities for yourself. And I have lots of friends who are super smart, went to the best schools, have incredible educations, but they haven't stretched themselves, as Jay, got outside their comfort zone and said, and I look back and I think, I think back to probably the biggest, I don't know if mistake is the right word, but my biggest regret is actually 1992, when I had a whole bunch of friends who were moving to Little Rock, Arkansas to work on Bill Clinton's campaign. And I was like, okay, who in their right mind is going to go sleep on a floor in Arkansas, for some guy who's running for president? And I watched all those people go get jobs in the White House and have really interesting opportunities. And I realized I let my aversion to risk stand in my way of trying something that I had no mortgage, I had no kids, I had nothing really that should have held me back from going and trying to do it, except for me and my unwillingness to kind of get outside what was my comfort zone. I guess the other thing, and Jay said something that's really important, which is build networks of friends and allies. Obviously, having mentors is really important, but also just having people. I mean, I am constantly amazed by the number of people who I met when I was 1 year out of college in 1990, 1991, who are now in really prominent positions all over the place. And I'm glad I didn't act too much, too immature at the time that they wrote me off forever. But also, 23-year-old boys are not always the smartest class. But also, recognizing that, and I tell people this all the time, recognizing, be nice to everybody, be collaborative with everybody, treat everybody like they're going to be a friend for life. Because the one thing I've realized over and over again is there are a lot of people who can't help you get the next job or the next opportunity, but you'd be shocked at the number of people who can keep you from getting it. And the number of times people who have no connection to anything that they would have known call me and say, what do you think of X person? And if it's somebody who I've frankly seen engage in bad behavior or not be a good team player, I'm usually pretty honest about saying that. And that person never would have had any idea. You talk about strategy. I mentioned a little bit earlier, just looking for the opportunities, keeping additional doors open, and really seeking opportunities. The other thing that I would say is this is something that I'm trying to teach my own children now, is my girls, because one of the things I've noticed about third grade girls in class is often girls are less willing to speak. Even my third grader, who some of you have met because she has wandered the halls of the Department of Commerce, she is not a shy kid, and she is not, but even her in class, she is not willing to speak up sometimes, because one of the things I've noticed is the boys overestimate their own ability and therefore are overconfident, and the girls, frankly, way underestimate their own ability and their own confidence and, frankly, their own competence. And so it leads to this skewing that, frankly, I'm trying to figure out how to teach that to my girls, of be confident in what you do because you have the abilities and you have the smarts, but don't be hesitant to come forward and be the one speaking up rather than just leaving a bunch of boys who are just running their mouths, talking. So those are, in terms of strategies, I think that's kind of the biggest. Let me just look at my, I think that's probably the biggest, in addition to just, not being afraid to take on new challenges, and not just because something is outside your comfort zone. I can't emphasize that enough, because that's how you stretch yourself and that's how you get the next opportunity.
Thank you so much, especially for those last comments. As I listen to both of you talk about risk, and then tie it into, Bruce, the behavior you see even as young as third grade, which is 9, 10 years old. What I think about for folks to think about is, be conscious and examine your own tolerance for risk. And one way to increase your appetite for risk is to think about what's the worst that could happen. Because many times our anticipation of this unknown downside can be dissipated a bit if you actually go to, okay, what is the worst thing that happens if I go, hey, I want to take a lead on this project, or maybe I want to be on this project? Well, somebody could say no, and your feelings could get hurt, right? Okay, nobody died, right? They could say yes. That might be a little scarier, right? But do kind of examine for yourself what your own risk tolerance is, and start to face what you think of as a risk by really thinking it through, and making sure that you're not walking by opportunities because you're afraid of the downside and you haven't even thought about what the downside really is. So you both also talked about mentoring or networking to help enhance kind of your own growth in your careers. I know one of the questions that I get asked sometime by women is, should women have women mentors? Or is it, what's the upside and downside of having a male mentor versus a female mentor? And also kind of, what should I think about if I'm thinking about having either an informal or formal mentor? So I know I'd love to hear both of your thoughts on the whole mentoring. And Jay, you mentioned kind of informal mentoring or networking. Bruce, you mentioned networking. So maybe talk about that continuum of kind of a really more formal partnership in career development and all the other ways you can really help work with people to develop your career.
I think in choosing a mentor that the gender overall is irrelevant, that there are certainly things and experiences that women, accomplished women have as a woman that are going to be very similar to what a younger woman starting her career. So certainly I think there's some benefit there, but I don't think that when you're choosing a mentor, you should, as a woman, choose a female mentor, or as a male, choose a male mentor. I think that someone who is accomplished in their career, if they're truly well accomplished and well-rounded, and you'll find this out very early on, that they're going to be able to relate to you, provide you insight and assistance, notwithstanding your mentor. That being said, there are absolutely things that I think that women can talk about from their experience, having been a woman, that Bruce or I would never be able to relate to. You know, just like there are things as an African-American male that I have experienced that Bruce would never be able to relate to, and vice versa. So in terms of whether you find it, and I think there are significant benefits of having formal mentorships, but also understand that I think that there are most people you come across in your career, and there's something you can take away, even if they're not that formal mentor, even if it's what not to do or what not to be like. So think of it as a continuum. It is an ongoing learning process. I have never thought that I was so accomplished and will never be so accomplished that I can't learn. So even as the mayor of Youngstown, Ohio, which was the biggest city in the region that I'm from, there were elected officials of smaller towns that I could have very easily sort of been dismissive of. Hey, I'm the young, up-and-coming mayor of the biggest city around. But I always made sure that I was learning from some of those who had been around longer. Even if their cities were a tenth the size of mine, there was something that I could learn and something that I could share. And I look at that here in my experiences at Commerce, getting together with other bureau heads who maybe larger bureaus, smaller bureaus who have been around longer, who have just recently gotten here. So in that instance, it might be an informal relationship, but there's something that I'm seeking to learn or something that I'm seeking to expand upon. So I don't think that learning ever stops, even if it's not in a formal mentorship, which I absolutely think it has its values. Very honestly, I'll end with a time that I get to spend with Secretary Pritzker. We do monthly check-ins, and I always try to take something away from there, you know, even in a very informal sense about how she treats me as a bureau head when I'm there, how she avails herself, and making sure that I'm learning from that and then applying it to my staff and my team. And I'll do that 2 years from now when I'm no longer at the Department of Commerce. Things that I've learned and valued here will still serve me well there. So I think from a formal and informal standpoint, and I certainly don't think you should limit yourself to a mentor of the same gender, but also know that there are those in that gender or in that ethnicity who can provide some insights that perhaps wouldn't be able to be provided otherwise.
You guys are probably getting a little sick of me agreeing with Jay, but I think his point is right, which is the following. Don't limit yourself either to one mentor or, frankly, I wouldn't limit by gender at all, because I think that, well, there is a lot of value, and I think there is a lot of good things that women can do, frankly, as mentors to other women. I'll never forget my sister telling a story when she was a medical school student at Harvard Medical School. She got a number of placements in different places that were really good for her development through the process. She eventually ended up being a dean at Harvard Med School, and then now is the dean of the Duke Med School. But the thing was interesting is she didn't find out until years later that there was actually a woman faculty member who was helping to guide all of her placements and giving her these opportunities that helped her to move her career forward. But, you know, I have to admit, I've never had a formal sort of somebody who has been my mentor. There are a lot of people who I approach it as, who do I want to be when I grow up? And Ellen Herbst is on that list, so that's a good thing. But I look at the people, who do I respect and what is it I respect about them? And then frankly, sometimes I'll just seek them out to talk to them and learn from their experience. I mean, I've also been very lucky, as Jay talked about Secretary Pritzker. She's been one of the people that I look across my career who I probably learned the most from in terms of leadership, but I've been really fortunate to work for, and one of the things I've sought out in jobs is who are the leaders you're working for. So I had the opportunity, working for Penny has been fantastic and just such a great learning experience. But, you know, working for Jay Rockefeller in the Senate was a really, you know, fascinating experience from an interesting guy. One of the reasons I went to Ford Motor Company, and at the time I did, everybody thought I was crazy because they thought I was going to a dying company. And Ford was really in a downward spiral, but it was 3 months after Alan Mulally had come in as the CEO, and now you kind of look back at the history and what's happened, and you realize, oh, maybe it wasn't such a bad decision to go work for a really fantastic leader who I could learn from. And so I've always sought out through my career working for leaders who I really feel like, even if it's not a formal mentorship type relationship, but people who I felt like would be really interesting. And the other thing, and I would encourage all of you to do this, which is make the time to help other people. I mean, one of the rules I've always lived by, and sometimes to my the people who do my scheduling's detriment, because they will tell you, two of them who are in the audience, who will tell you that's not always easy. But if people ask me to sit down and talk to them, I always do it. And, and it a little fluctuates based on time. But, there is a time, like when I was the General Counsel of the Senate Commerce Committee, I probably met with 100 people in a year who were interested in career advice and just looking. So don't be hesitant to reach out to people who you find interesting and ask them for that advice. Because my experience is not everybody will do it, and sometimes people will be legitimately very busy and they'll have challenges, but the good people will make the time to do it. And will want to sit down and want to be helpful. They'll talk about your experience. They'll talk about their experience. They can give you guidance. You have to go in with a little sense of what you want to do. But the interesting thing is, almost regardless of what age you are and where your station is in the hierarchy of things, you have something to offer to the people who come behind you. And so I hope you will all take advantage. And frankly, no matter how far you are up on the ladder, you also have a lot to learn from a lot of people around you. And so, seek out those relationships. Don't be shy about it. To the point earlier of taking a little bit of risks and getting outside your comfort zone. Because sometimes it's a little awkward to go to people you don't know and say, would you be willing to make a half hour just to sit down and talk to me? But it is one of the most valuable things you can do. And frankly, the best place to start, and I literally think of it, and it's kind of my joke, is who do I want to be when I grow up? And so there are a whole bunch of people in this town who I've gotten to know just because I've thought they've had interesting careers and they've made their way by being really good people who people like and respect, and they've done well for themselves.
Great answers, and I'm over here going what they said too. So one last question that I'll direct to you before we open it up to the larger audience. And this goes to, once you've been working on your career and progressing in your career for some number of years, in my case, I'm now into my fourth decade, you do develop these little shorthand nuggets that kind of characterize some of your career advice that you give over and over and over again. It's kind of one of, for me, and folks who I've talked to hear me say this all the time, one of the things that I always say over and over again, not because I say I've got to remember to say this, but because it's top of my mind, is you own your own career. And you've got to invest in yourself. Nobody else will pay more attention to your career than you will. So I don't know if either one of you have those kind of touchstones that when you do have multiple meetings with people, is there the one or two things that you always, always say, because it's kind of bedrock of what you believe? And then we'll open it up for questions.
So I'm happy to take that first. And there are really three. One I mentioned earlier, which is get in the game, don't sit on the sidelines. The second is one that I kind of have used to live my life by, but enjoy the journey and keep your sense of humor about you. That's actually one of the things I love about Ellen, because I know at any meeting, no matter how serious or dire the situation is, I can turn around and both of us will have something humorous to observe about the situation that frankly helps you get through even the toughest of times. And then the last one, and this is more gauged at younger people, and it's not, you guys don't listen who are law school students right now, which is don't go directly from college to law school. If you guys have done this, by the way, you made a great choice. But for the rest of you, take time off and figure out what you want to do in life, and take a little bit time to experience life. And for everybody who's older, but I always find, particularly with the interns, people who want to just rush right off and figure out what the next step in their life is. And the thing I always say is don't worry about it. The next steps will be there. You're talented, you're smart, you've gotten this far, but enjoy life a little bit and figure out that path.
So I would say, two of the things that were mentioned to me throughout my life and early in my career that I share, and again, depending on the audience, and it came from the same individual. So first and foremost, my parents have had a profound influence on my work ethic, my outlook in life, and making sure that I was exposed to a whole host of experiences and people that would help shape ultimately, where I would end up in the path that I would follow. But in particular, one of my, if not a formal mentor, someone who certainly had a significant impact, a former pastor of mine, early on when we were young, would always tell us, never be intimidated, never be manipulated. And we would say that, and I don't think it was until later in life that you could come to appreciate what that meant. Because now as I look back, so many of the people that I've seen fall by the wayside or get involved in a number of things who are genuinely good people ended up there because they were manipulated by others. They were, even if they didn't go along or agree with it, they allowed themselves to be put in positions that they individually would not have otherwise succumbed to. And the other part of that, never being intimidated, I still to that day find that interesting, because here in Washington, D.C., as Bruce talked about, lots of accomplished people with very impressive pedigrees. And I have a bachelor's degree from Youngstown State University. It is not a Ivy League institution. It's a fine school. But at the same time, to walk into a meeting with PhDs and folks from, the most storied and hallowed institutions can be a little bit intimidating. But to Bruce's point, I have to get in the game. I can sit there and sort of say, well, I've got my degree from Youngstown State University, so I should be quiet. Or I can insert myself in the game, contribute, and be a part of that experience. So never be intimidated, never be manipulated, particularly when I'm talking to people who are early on in their career. And the other thing that Bishop Wagner often shared that to this day resonates with me is that significance is paramount to success. So we all hopefully can aspire to be successful, and I want to have a successful career, but more than a successful career, I want my work to be significant. So the work that we're doing at EDA, I want that work to be significant. The work that I get to do as assistant secretary, whether or not someone ultimately judges me as a successful assistant secretary or as a successful mayor or as a successful individual, I want them to say, you know what, but the work that he did, the work that they did, the things that they accomplished were significant. And to me, if you're significant, I define that as success. Now, other people will say, well, I just want to be successful in terms of my title or what I make or how many people remember my name or how many people remember the work that I did. And that's fine. But to me, the resonating fact of having significance being much more important to success, I think by pursuing that significance, I will look back and think that if we were significant in moving the needle in the communities we serve, or my administration was significant in trying to leave Youngstown a little bit better off than I found that, I don't have to be on a list of most successful things as other people might define it.
It's terrific. Thank you both. And now comes the hard part, which are the questions you didn't know about. So now it's your turn. We've got, I see Sonora's in the back, and there you are with another microphone. So who's got a question? Just raise your hand. Okay, up here. And don't forget about what Bruce said. Raise your hand and ask questions.
Yeah, my name is Ping Sang. I'm from IT office. I'm director of IT security audit. So I'm doing the work to make department security, system. So I have a question. Actually, I came from other federal agencies to the Commerce 5 years ago, and my group at that time was a male boss for many years. They're all so familiar with work with hand. So he got promoted, so I came in as a, little lady woman, so as their boss. So all my staff is male. So, and I just like to know, is any situation you have a boss or either male or female, how you feel, as a boss, female boss, have this male staff. What I need to pay attention to do, to learn, to manage. What's the major difference staff could feel between male boss and female boss?
That's a good question, because I think part of it is it's very specific to the individuals. For example, The experience working for Penny Pritzker was very different for me than working for Becky Blank, for example. They're two very different personalities, both very efficient, effective, smart leaders, but very different. And I guess what I would say is, I think about what is in common between those two individuals, for example, and looking at what made them both successful. And I think one is they were both people who came in and earned your respect. They both came in new to positions and really focused on earning the respect of the people around them. I think second is they were both people who were very clear and direct about what their expectations were and what, in giving guidance of what they expected from the team. And I think third is they set high expectations and they said, okay, this is what we want to achieve. Here is the direction that we're taking this department and what I want to accomplish, or what we want to accomplish. And I think the we is the key part, which is what are we all going to accomplish working together and focusing on that.
I would say if the people who are reporting to you now, the majority of which who, if I understand you, are male, if they're going to have a problem with you as their boss, make sure you allow it to be their problem and not yours. Your role is to establish consistency. You have a leadership style, you have expectations that you set. You should come in, I would say, I would come into this, not you should, but I would recommend you come into this with whatever expectations of performance that the prior person had. If you agree with those expectations of performance, once you communicate that, that's it. So again, it goes to the individual. If those individuals have a problem working for you as a female boss now, that is their problem to resolve. You've said, here are the expectations. You have said, here's my style. I am available to you as a resource. I'm available for you to support. Other than that, I expect us to continue moving forward with the mission. It wouldn't serve you well to start wondering and concerning yourself, well, do they see me differently as a woman boss? Do they have an issue with me? Should I act a little bit differently or change a little bit differently? If you would handle things differently than the predecessor because that's something you would do, that's fine. But not to do it because there is any inkling or concern that they might have an issue. If they have an issue, it's their issue, and you will hold them accountable for their performance, but it shouldn't be an issue that you have to consider or wrestle with because obviously you were deemed competent and qualified to do the job that you're doing, and it's their role and their obligation to carry forward the mission of that particular department.
I got to get in on this answer too. So, and it's going to be to double down and do so with some personal experience. So, we are aware that we are women, and if you have all men working for you or you work for all men. But two things I would say. One is a good manager is a good manager is a good manager. The keys to being a good manager of people or tasks they are not gender specific. Now, having said that, I've been a supervisor or manager since I was 24 years old. And until I came to the government, most of the places I worked, I was one of the few women in the room, let alone in management. Okay, so I've worked in male-dominated organizations. And I know the question comes up sometime, do I have to be tougher than I'm thinking I am? Do I have to be like macho, like they are, right? And here's what I would say to that. You have to be authentic to your own style, because being authentic is one of the keys to being a good manager. And if you are putting on some kind of style because you think, I need to do this to be successful, I mean, you need to be aware of what management tools in your tool bag and which pieces of your style are more appropriate in different situations. But if you're trying to put on a whole different persona in your management style because you're a woman and you think you have to act a certain way to male employees, that is not, in my experience, a long-term, successful, sustainable approach. So be authentic to your own style. But remember, there are keys to good management that just are universal truths, basically. So, another question?
Tammy Rambert from the Patent and Trademark Office. I'm a becoming professional, so how do you channel coming up and being professional and working with other women, and they don't know how to take, you being strong and aggressive and wanting the job done. So how do you go up the ladder without being knocked down, and being effective and being savvy to get up to that GS-15 without having other women or other colleagues try to kind of, deter you from the mission. So how do you take that and continue on your path and on your journey and be positive?
Understand that that's going to happen. You can't control what other people think of you, what they will or won't do to deter you or help you. So to the extent that it is always good to be aware, to the extent that you equip and prepare yourself for the mission at hand to take on the assignments, as Bruce said, if there's an opportunity to take on an additional assignment, to take that assignment on. And there will be people who say, there she goes again, or who look at you or act a certain way because you have taken on that assignment. So one of the things that I had to learn early on is not everybody's going to like you. I mean, that's just a fact of life. And you can't spend your time trying to placate. Now, again, you don't go out and purposely make enemies. You try to be peaceable and reasonable. But even you doing all, quote unquote, the right things, there are going to be folks who just don't like you for reasons you understand and reasons you don't. But you're deciding that this is a career path and a career ladder you want to climb, understanding what are the necessary skills and characteristics and traits and knowledge that you need to acquire to do that, understanding that there'll be times where you present yourself and you still don't get that opportunity or you get knocked down. And again, it's discouraging, it's frustrating, but it's not a reason to say, okay, well, I did all the right things and it didn't happen. That goes to those obstacles of, okay, well, what's another way to get around doing that? So, it's human dynamics in every office. We're not immune to them. So it's not that it's always going to feel good or your feelings aren't going to be hurt or you'd like better dynamics. But at the end of the day, people are going to make judgments, justified or not, are going to like you or not like you based on a whole host of things that you can't spend your time worrying about. It is great to treat, and I agree with Bruce, treat people with respect, treat them nicely, but if it's not reciprocated, don't spend an inordinate amount of time worrying yourself about it. Your focus, your mission is what are the things necessary for me to move up to that next ladder in my career. At the end of the day, there's a saying that said, people aren't thinking about you as much as you think they're thinking about you. We all have that. And I'm famous for that. I got it. People, they really aren't. A handful of them are, but it's not worth the time or the effort or the energy to try to figure out, and placate their position, as it relates to what you're trying to accomplish.
I would just add to that. I think especially the further you, and actually it's really at every level. It's not even the further you go up the ladder, that there will always be people who don't view the world as everyone in their own right. They view it as a zero-sum world, for one, that if you're gaining, somehow they are losing. Or, often my experience is the people who are the most like that, usually it's motivated out of their own insecurity rather than anything about you. And I think the point that Jay made is the right one, which is just focus on doing your business, doing the best job you possibly can, and frankly, working when it really gets, if it does get particularly out of line, having a dialogue with your boss about, hey, look, I'm doing my best job, but I want you to understand the circumstance here if it really becomes out of line. But I think we've all been in circumstances where we've had people around us who we feel like are trying to take us down because they don't want to see you get ahead. And that's an awful feeling because, frankly, the first thing you always do is you say, okay, is it something about me rather than often, and one of the pieces of wisdom I've gained with age is much more often, it's about them than anything else you've done. And it's about their own personal insecurity, but you've got to build the wall to yourself around that and say, you know what, I'm just going to work that much harder because it's not about them, it is about me and my ability to succeed and my ability to do my job with excellence and not worry about the people around me.
Hello, my name is Amina. I'm an intern at ITA for the International Trade Administration. And so earlier, thank you first of all for being here. Earlier, I've heard, I think both of you mentioned choosing who's gonna be the flexible parent. And I think a huge issue is that a lot of women, young women growing up, they limit their potentials because automatically when they think about their careers, they're like, wait, this requires travel. oh, what's my husband going to say about that? Who's going to take care of the kids? And they don't even have like a husband yet or anything, but they're already considering that. And I find myself personally constantly doing this, and it kind of scares me because I feel like so many women have so much potential, but they automatically, just because of how society is, they automatically are worried that, wait, this is not going to work out. I'm going to work hard and then not be able to achieve this goal. So I was wondering, what advice do you guys have for women who do this and do limit themselves to their full potential?
Well, you point out you raise a great issue. The fact in 2015 that we still have these mechanisms or this way of thinking that as much as we have progressed, that young women are still dealing with that. And we see it, and the president has made an issue of the fact that the first legislation he signed was the Lilly Ledbetter Act, and the fact that we still have issues of equal pay and perceptions of who the flexible parent is. So to the extent that you can find individuals who, and again, just a couple of individuals, you may or may not subscribe to them, but well, again, we can start with people on the stage like Ellen and those who have spoken here, Secretary Pritzker and Michelle Wee and Dr. Kathy Sullivan and others we've seen in the news, whether it's Marissa Myers at Yahoo or Sheryl Sandberg, women who have certainly faced that and who are accomplished in their own right, and to the extent that they provide insight as to how to battle that. Again, I obviously have never been a young woman, early in a career having to battle those things. But I can tell you that at home, it's a discussion that my wife, who is accomplished in her own right, she still struggles with. So it is not something that easily passes just, once you get a little further in your career. With a 4-year-old son, and I know as a spouse, I try to do my part and allow my default position to be, can I offer to help? Because often, if she asks me, I'm like, oh yeah, I feel like a hero. Oh, you've asked me to take a couple hours off work to take Ethan to the doctor. Well, how about me saying, hey, let me volunteer before she has to ask me, instead of having the default position to be, well, if she asks me, I'll do it. If not, she knows I'm busy doing important work. So it's difficult, but I would say that individuals, whether you have them right here at your fingertips or those that we've seen and read about and who have put out their own positions on how to battle that, it's an ongoing, and it's unfortunate still in 2015, as far as we've come, that's still a very significant issue.
Yeah, and I would just add to that a couple things. I mean, one is don't limit yourself, because it starts with you and what your expectation is. And not that I'm going to give relationship advice to anybody about what they should look for in choosing partners, but frankly, if someone isn't willing to enter into it as a partnership, you at least got to take that into account in how you view them and frankly, how they're going to be. I was mentioning earlier, I mean, my wife and I, have gone through, we've actually almost always been fortunate that we have not been traveling at the same time, and that, there was one year where I went through the auto bailout when I was working at Ford, and literally like on almost the day it ended, the drafting of the TARP legislation started, and she was in this crazy, trapped for 3 weeks in the Capitol helping to write the TARP legislation, and that ended, and then she was she led Tim Geithner's confirmation. And during that period, it was, okay, I've got to pick up the slack, and I've got to take, and we've been lucky because literally it's been a trade-off. There's only been one time when we looked at our calendars and said, okay, we're both going to be in airplanes that night. What are we going to do with our children? Because somebody's got to be home with them. But it is a partnership, and it should be. And frankly, look, I'm not one to give relationship advice, but you should expect nothing less than that if that's what you want, because the only one who limits you is yourself, and don't do that to yourself.
Yeah, that's a really fine point. I think we're talking about two different things here. One is the practical, how do you manage the situation when you're in it? But I think the point you really raise is we're doing it to ourselves, we're limiting ourselves in our own minds, and whether it be because of gender, whether it be because of race or ethnicity, whether it be because of the school we went to or the formal degree we have, or our lifelong held perceptions of what we're good at or not good at, I think the first step is being mindful that we are doing that to ourselves. Because if you're mindful of it, you can at least bring it forward to the conscious part of your brain and start dealing with it, right? And then the whole reality of once you're in a situation where you're coping with how do I have work-life balance is a separate thing. And understanding that, I think, is an important step.
Okay.
Good afternoon. First of all, thank you so much for being here. It's really a wonderful experience to have advice from professionals such as yourselves. My name is Ashley Fleming. I'm currently an intern here, as well as a student at American University. I study IR and economics. And with that being said, I have a large focus on national security, which historically is a very male-dominated industry. As a young woman, working professional, I had a question for you specifically, but everyone here, being professionals and with a large experience in the public service sector. What are the biggest barriers you've really seen that prevents maybe a growing diversity for women in a field such as national security and being leaders in the federal government? What do you think managers or leaders in office sectors can really do to help alleviate and increase this diversity? And maybe on an even larger note, beyond the idea of increasing the number of women in the workplace, even more diverse federal public sector for the changing face of the United States.
So first of all, I spent 25 years in the private sector. I've spent the last 10 in government. The federal government is the much better employer of choice for women. If you look at the numbers, and you look at the number of women in various level of management positions on average across the government, they're much better in federal government than in typical, I'll say, Main Street corporate America. Okay, so that's number one. Number two, and I don't know the national security field well, but I would say to you, now is a better time than ever to be a woman in that area, and here's why. When national security was about military strength, and mostly about military strength, and women were not allowed to be in the uniformed service in any kind of real capacity, that was a real barrier. But national security is about so much more than just military strength. So it requires a much more diverse viewpoint. It's about economic security, it's about cyber security, it's about international relationships, and I've just come to the end of my knowledge of national security, so I'm going to turn it over to somebody else who knows a whole lot more about it. But I do believe that as our view of what national security means has had to expand because of the new threats that we live in this world, that it opens the door for more diversity in the national security arena.
And to that point, Bruce is going to be the expert, but on the diversity point, who would have thought that an African-American woman, Susan Rice, would be in a position of advising the president on issues of national security, Samantha Power. So there are a whole host of women now, to Ellen's point, that under this administration, you have seen women elevated, and not just elevated like the president did it, but who have now taken commanding positions in an area that for far too long was seen as the respite of the war generals, the war heroes who went off and fought the wars while the women stayed home and kept the home front and home fires burning. So those individuals, they must know how to best position this country on that front of national security. But because it has taken on so many different facets now, just the diversity right there between Samantha Power and Susan Rice, and there are a whole host of other individuals that I'm sure Bruce can articulate that are at the forefront of national security. What we should be doing is making sure that they aren't, and this was one of the early questions, aren't the sort of the first and the only. That it was a blip on a radar screen. It was great under that administration, but that was something that this president did. It was not because we don't have a whole host of other women coming up as capable and competent of filling those leadership positions on national security.
Yeah, and I think, look, national security has always been one of the most male-dominated, but I do think you're seeing the world change. I think, right now, having Susan Rice, as Jay mentioned, but also having 3 of the 4 deputy national security advisors be women, having the chief of staff at the NSC be a woman, having, had a woman secretary of state following another woman secretary of state in Condoleezza Rice. I do think there's a much broader, and I think we are probably not that far from seeing perhaps a woman president, and perhaps seeing a woman Secretary of Defense. So I think that world is changing. You're undoubtedly right that it is traditionally been dominated, and it's slow. I mean, because frankly, it's probably the slowest of all of the fields, but I also think it's catching up. So hang in there, because I do think it's changing. And frankly, that's why it's so important you do it, and so important that you charge forward, because you're going to be the one who helps change it as well. So keep doing what you're doing.
Hi, my name is Sarah Lee from the Policy Office in the Secretary's Office. Thank you for all being here. It's a really great event. It's both inspiring, but it's also a little bit, I want to say because you two are here, it's great that we have this different perspective on these issues regarding women. And so the whole conversation has been focused on what the women can do. And so I was just wondering your input on just are there any substantive things we can do to empower the whole workplace to be thinking about these issues and talking about them and being more sensitive to the challenges that women face?
So I've spent my whole life as a woman, but not necessarily defining myself first as a woman in the workplace. But I do know that diversity of thought and diversity of experience makes us so much better and so much stronger, and we come up with better solutions. So I tend to think of it as, how do we get more diversity? And we tend to first define diversity from visual characteristics, right? Because we're a visual species. So we tend to run down the list of diversity, and it's all the things we can look at and see are different about people. But what that really represents is a difference of experience, skills, life, viewpoint, et cetera. And I think if we think about it that way, it becomes a much more powerful platform to say, how do we move forward and get more of this? Because then we can talk about it in terms of, how do we get stronger and better at delivering the mission? Well, I'm sorry, in 2015, there's been enough studies done that says a group that's diverse does better at solving problems, at being creative, about every aspect of moving forward a mission that you can think of. A diverse group has been proven again and again to do better than a non-diverse group. So to me, that's the basis on which we should talk about how we move the ball forward.
And I totally agree with that. And I think going back to the national security, I think that's one that's actually particularly important. I think one of the reasons the president has looked for a broad group is having people of different backgrounds and experiences. I would also say, though, and I think the analogy I always look to in the workplace is, you want your team to be like a toolbox. And if you're trying to build a house and you had a whole toolbox full of saws, you wouldn't be very successful at building a house. You need the hammers, you need the nails, you need the screwdrivers, you need the, all the other pieces that go with it. And so having a diversity of thought, and I actually think it's interesting, I think until now, Jay and I both come from small kind of cities far away from Washington, which it's the diversity of experience people bring in so many more ways than I think often appears on the surface of it. And one of the things that I look to when I'm building my teams is, how do I get a broad set of people with different experiences, different backgrounds, that are going to bring different perspectives that will add to the whole thing to make it, frankly, much stronger than if you just had a lot of people who were similar in one way or another.
Mango with the ITA. Hi, Bruce. I just want to say that there's a mentoring program in the department that I have been a participant of for many years. And Bruce is right. No matter where you are in the ladder, what your rank is, you always have something to learn and something to teach. So I would encourage all of you to check out the mentoring program and either volunteer to be a mentor or be a mentee, or be both at the same time. So that's the first thing. The second thing I want to say is that people don't want to talk about this issue, but there are many bosses who are not as open-minded or as helpful as you three are. And being a mentor, I get to hear the distress from people who don't know how to deal with all the mental anguish. So again, when you are participating in the mentoring program, find someone you're comfortable with, no matter what their rank, what their gender is, and have that person be your friend, to share with you ways to cope when things get too difficult and you can't deal with colleagues and you can't take it home because people at home don't understand the situation at work. So, and finally, my own example is that looking at me, you wouldn't think I would be working on Ukraine issues, right? But I guess I was busy working on EU issues, and then they needed help on Ukraine when the situation warrants it, and I was volunteered by somebody, I don't know who, and I knew nothing, but I jumped into it, and like Bruce said, I got into the game, and today I can say that I can participate in discussions, and I have been doing that around town, not as a speaker, but as an audience member, and I can speak knowingly and ask intelligent questions and interact with people about Ukraine. So many people are coming to me asking me about Ukraine. And they don't look at me as, why is she working on it? And I always come clean. I said, I don't know much, but when we start talking, I know much more than I let on. So Bruce is right. When I first started, I was very hesitant. I didn't want to speak up. I didn't want to share what I knew about all my experiences. But the fact that I didn't know Ukraine a year ago, and I do now, is incidental to the fact that I have many years of experience in other fields, and once people start talking to me and we start interacting, that comes through. So I would encourage you to take all of these advice to heart, but join the program and get started.
Hi, so my name's Haider Shuja. I come from the University of California at Davis, and I'm an intern at ITA, and I just wanted to ask the question, what can men do to better serve as allies and better point out bias in the workplace for our women colleagues? Just being in a position of privilege, I think it's really important that us as men, we understand what we can do, and I wanted to just kind of get your perspective and kind of understand solutions as to how we can achieve a more equal workforce for our female colleagues.
But as a colleague, pointing out and identifying when you see inequities or injustices in the workplace, and again, not doing it as a man because that's the thing that we men do is point out these things, for the women, but as a colleague, as a professional colleague, being respectful. I know I've got a number of flaws and shortcomings, and being trying to be more aware of those, to the point that was pointed out by both Ellen and Bruce, is the diversity of opinions and input and perspectives that I get and value from being, a male, having females and women in leadership positions, whether they're in leadership positions or not. It really is irrelevant to me, just the diversity of those perspectives. So I think valuing that diversity of perspectives, I think to the extent of being aware of the barriers and sensitive to them and pointing them out when appropriate, being seen, again, as someone who is respectful and is a resource and, someone that can be approached, all those things. So I don't know if there's anything particular we can do as males, but what we can do as good, responsible, professional colleagues, being supportive of the individuals that we work with. And if there is something as a male, is again, just being conscious that there are still those biases out there, that in 2015, we still have young women facing certain stereotypes or expectations, and not to think that, well, it's 2015, so we've arrived, I don't know what you're complaining about, everything is everything is equal and we're all competing on a level playing field, because we're not. The reality is we're not. The data that shows that there is still women who do the same exact work, who have the same exact qualifications as their male counterparts, on balance, are still not equally paid. So to take the position, well, I don't know, it is what it is, that's certainly something that I think is detrimental. So again, other than those things that we should be aware of, I'm not sure if there's anything we can do as men versus things we should just be doing as supportive, respectful colleagues, and understanding the value that our colleagues, particularly because we're talking about enterprising women, bring to the workplace or to the particular environment that we're a part of.
Yeah, and I would fully agree with that, which is you start off by treating everybody with the respect and with as colleagues. But I do think in talking earlier about building networks and alliances in the workplace, look, there can sometimes be a propensity of men to create the boys club, and be conscious of that and be aware of that. Don't put yourself in that situation. If you look around and the same 5 people you go to lunch with every day are all guys and you're sitting talking about, some work-related issue, that you would actually benefit from having other people involved. Be conscious of those things, and be conscious how you interact, and frankly, be conscious. I mean, one of the things I'm very conscious of in meetings is who is talking. And if I see somebody who I think, has something valuable to say and they're holding back, or frankly, just bringing other people into the conversation. Because, to my point earlier, watching my daughter's third grade class, that may not actually be that different from some workplaces where, men are very quick to talk and to not have a whole lot of filter, and women who have as much, if not more, to say sometimes are not as quick to be the first one into the conversation or to hold back, but drawing those people in, because frankly, that's when you get that's when you get the best input from everybody, but being conscious of the dynamics around you. But I think also, and I have to admit, I probably benefited from this in my own career, of building a broad network of friends of both genders, because at the end of the day, there is a propensity to boys club, and I think there are other parts of, clearly, other workplaces you look around and you say, oh yeah, that's a total boys club. I mean, there's some agencies I think are more like that than others, but you really need to be conscious of that and be aware to make sure that you're not, even if you're just subtly doing it and you don't mean to do it. Fortunately, I've got 4 women in my office who beat me down if I would ever do that, so I'm in a pretty good place. But be conscious of that and be aware of how you're treating people around you.
Cognizant of the time too. So are we down to our last? Wait. Last question or two, or what are we thinking? Last one. Okay.
Okay. Thank you. My name is Jamisa Moon. I'm recently transferred from OMB to Commerce, and I find myself transitioning again. I was the Director of Human Resources for FirstNet, and my question, I'm going to take gender out of it just a little bit. One quick question for each of you, if you could share the one characteristic that you believe every leader should have.
I would say empathy. Just having empathy and understanding that you are presently in a leadership position, but you didn't drop out of heaven into that leadership position, despite what some of the leaders might think. Having empathy and being able to understand and value and appreciate the perspective of everyone in the room, everyone on the team, having walked in their shoes perhaps and remembering the days. So I would say, one of the characteristics that I would say is a leader of having that empathy.
I'm going to cheat, and I'm actually going to cite 2, which is, one is going back to what I said earlier, which is treating everything as a team and recognizing that none of this is an individual sport, it's all a team sport. The second one, though, and it a little bit goes to what Jay said, which is how you treat the people around you. And you should treat the people, whether they're above you, below you, or your peers, all the same and with respect, rather than, the number of people and managers who I've seen who manage up really well, but who manage down terribly. And recognizing, and this is one of the lessons I learned a long time ago, is the people around you, so a lot of these people, the skills that you're teaching them and the experiences they're having, they're going to carry to some other place in the future. And so really treating everybody with respect, whether they are the most junior member of your team or whether they're your boss, and everybody in between.
And I'm going to caveat by saying there is no one thing, because one thing about leadership is you have to have skill and ability in a number of areas, but I'll add to the ones that have already been talked about. And the first word that came to my mind was courage, but that might signal something different than what I think I'm really thinking about. And it's really the integrity of thought, mind, action, consistency, owning your responsibility and owning the consequences of your decisions and modeling that for your team. I would add to both what Jay and Bruce said. And there's a whole bunch more things. Well, I think we are going to wrap it up. I
thought there was one more. I think they had their hands up
Oh, I'm sorry.
simultaneously.
I'm sorry.
If we can.
All right, one more.
I'm sorry.
I'm sorry, I did not see you back there.
No, I'm sorry. I'm making you stay for so long. My name is Susanna Dean. I'm an intern at EDA under.
And not just because she was at EDA.
Picking favorites already. I just graduated from college last month, And I decided
Congratulations.
Thank you very much. And I find myself as an intern once again, but that's okay. So again, taking gender out of it for the time being, because I think my resume is great, and I think that my school was great, but there are so many people who are also 22 and in Washington and have competitive resumes and big dreams. How would you, as leaders, recommend someone my age making themselves stand out in the workplace, as I'm working with people like Jay, and you know, I have the honor of working at Commerce? How would you recommend that while I'm here, I network in a way that makes me memorable?
Well, again, that goes to, I think, what we've talked about in terms of relationships. So you're right. There's a lot of great resumes out there, great schools, 20-some-year-olds who are ambitious with big dreams. But in terms of differentiating, the fact that you're here, the fact that you're asking that question, the fact that you have, you know, at your disposal people like Ellen Herbst, people like, you know, Bruce, and so many others. Within EDA, and again, not just because she's here, but you've got two individuals here. You've got Tanae Dolphin, and you've got Breland Pete, two women who are accomplished in their own right, who I have seen firsthand, you know, take individuals, both male and females, but in this instance, young women, under their wings, share their experiences, not only their own individual experiences, but introduce them to others. And that's also about those relationships, because the people that they've known over the course of their career, it means something when Tanae or Breland or any of the other folks within EDA introduce you, you know, as someone who, you know, has a background, has some experiences. So it is about differentiating yourself, because there's always someone who went to a school with a slightly higher rating, or there's always somebody whose resume looks just a little bit better from their standpoint or from your standpoint. So it really isn't about schools. And you've done the basic work to get in the door. The school and the resume, you've done the basic work. So it is now about taking these opportunities in the internship that Bruce talked about, taking that additional assignment. And not just because you want to get noticed, but because it takes you out of your comfort zone. It gives you new skills, that exposes you to, you know, new people that you might not otherwise have been exposed to. But at this point in your career, it's really about networking, establishing relationships, and not just networking in a formal sense, although that's important. Establishing relationships, taking the time while you have with individuals like Tanae and Breland and so many others to really sit down and have those conversations. And then people outside of EDA, who, you know, can you go to lunch with? Who can you, you know, spend some time with? Whose brain can you pick? That's ultimately and I'll talk from my own experience, how I found myself being able to differentiate. There was really some assignments that I took on that either no one wanted or I didn't really want, but I knew was relevant to the company, that led me to directly having additional opportunities. And I didn't do it to get promoted, but I look back now, and because of those assignments that I did take on, it led to a whole host of other opportunities. And it did differentiate me from the other 24 loan officers that were at the bank at that time that chose not to take that assignment on.
And I guess, and I fully agree with everything Jay said, because you've gotten in the game, you're here, which is good. Go look for the tough assignments, because that will help differentiate you. But the other thing I would say, and this is really important, it's going to seem really basic, but it's really true, which is do your best at every single thing you do. And remember, and this is frankly true for everybody in the room, for all of us, every single thing we do, we're being judged on by people. And in every interaction you have with people, you can either gain share or you can lose share. And so if you're given an assignment, and this is like one of those tests that I always am a big believer in, you give somebody, you ask them to make copies for you. If somebody does a sloppy job of making copies, or doesn't put the staple in the right place and doesn't care enough to do it right, are you going to give them more responsibility and trust them to do something right? So remembering that every single thing you do, you want to do your very best at, because when you don't, you're going to be judged on it, and people are going to say, do I trust that person to do more? And in many cases, when you see somebody who doesn't do their best at stuff, you're not going to invest and give them the next opportunity, because you're not going to have the faith in their ability to, you know, do the next job with the care and the focus and the consistency and the hard work that they've done that job.
Yeah, and what I call that is strive to be someone that can be relied upon, especially early in your career. We talk a lot about leadership at senior levels and so forth, and that's important. When you're starting out in your career, you're not going to get very far until you can demonstrate that you can be trusted to be handed an assignment and to deliver it well and on time and without a lot of drama. And yes, you have to then also open your eyes and reach out and network and all that, but you got to pay attention to what you're assigned to do too. And what I find sometimes with folks in this town, because we have so many young people who have been top of their game through school, and they're thinking way ahead into their careers, and they sometimes neglect to think about, I've got to this is a new game. I'm now the intern. I'm now the youngest kid in the office. And they're thinking about where they want, the job that might be 5 to 10 years away as what they want to do next, and they're not concentrating enough on, can I depend on you? And the copier one is a really good one to keep in your mind if you're a young person, because I think a lot of people go, hey, I just graduated with a 3.8 GPA from, pick your favorite, high-end school. What the heck? My first job is like, I don't know, taking notes in a meeting and then spitting them out in email, and nobody will let me do anything else. If you don't do a good job at that task, nobody's going to give you anything else to do. So that's my tough love part of the advice is be someone who can be relied on to get the job done, and then take on the hard jobs. Once they have confidence in you, they'll start giving you the hard jobs.
Because often, you might not notice, but you may be working for folks whose first job was making, $3.35 an hour, flipping hamburgers at McDonald's. So we don't get real impressed. We remember, and it was a while ago, but if you can't take that, you're sitting in some cushy office and getting emails, and it wasn't about emails on our first job. So yeah, you got to get that. That's easy compared to what we were doing. So
I was gonna say my first job was doing data entry 9 hours a day, and I was the backup driver for a senator. I wasn't even the real driver. I was the backup driver. So this is another one of my rules, which is remember everybody starts somewhere, right. And it's not where you start; it's where you finish. And there are a lot of people who you might look and say, wow, their first job was better than my first job. Well, wait and see what their last job was or is, because that's what really counts, not where you start.
Okay, so now that we've revealed to you what our first jobs were, mine was taking tickets in a parking lot. That's probably a great place to stop. I want to thank Jay and Bruce for joining us. We've talked about getting a diversity of viewpoint. I think it's terrific that the Enterprising Women's Series has brought in a bit of diversity in the series. So I want to thank both of you for taking what is a lot of time out of your schedule to be with us. I want to thank Karen and Sonora, and who am I missing? Erica, and Erica, who once again have put on, I think, a great event on behalf of all of us. So thank you all, and thank you for all of your attention. Take care.